My name is Daniel Voss, and for 11 months, I fought a war that nobody else in my neighborhood even knew was happening. It wasn't fought with lawyers, at least not at first. It was fought with a post-hole digger, a headlamp, and a stubbornness I inherited from a man who never once backed down from anything in his life. My grandfather, Walt. Let me start at the beginning, because the ending is the kind of thing you won't believe unless you understand exactly how it started. I moved into Maple Hollow Estates 3 years ago. It's one of those newer developments outside the city, the kind with a stone entrance sign, a community clubhouse with a pool, and a homeowners association that takes itself a little too seriously. When I bought the house, I didn't think twice about the property lines. The listing agent walked me through the paperwork, I signed where I was told to sign, and I moved my life into a modest 3-bedroom on the edge of the development, right where the manicured lawns gave way to a stretch of older oak trees that predated the entire subdivision. What I didn't know, what nobody in that HOA office knew, not even the woman who'd run it for 6 years, was that the back edge of my property, the part that bordered the clubhouse and the little parking lot beside it, wasn't accurately drawn on any modern plat map. It had been miscopied, decades earlier, in a clerical error that nobody had ever caught. And that error was about to become the most important thing in my life. The trouble started with a fence. When I bought the house, there was an old wooden fence running along the back property line, grey and weathered, clearly older than the subdivision itself. It had been there long before Maple Hollow existed, back when this land belonged to a series of family farms. I liked that fence. It felt like a piece of history I got to keep. So when a storm knocked down about 30 feet of it that first spring, I rebuilt it exactly where it had always stood. 2 weeks later, I got a letter from the HOA. It was polite at first, the way these things always start. A notice explaining that the fence I'd repaired extended approximately 4 feet onto common area maintained by the association, and that I would need to either move it or apply for a variance. I called the HOA office, spoke to a property manager named Renee, and explained that the fence had been there since before the neighborhood was built. She was sympathetic but firm. Association rules were association rules. I needed to move the fence or take it down. I didn't want to make trouble. I was new to the neighborhood. I had a full-time job as a structural inspector, and I didn't have the energy for a fight over 4 feet of grass. So I hired a surveyor to settle it once and for all, thinking a professional opinion would clear everything up in an afternoon. It didn't clear anything up. It opened a door I didn't know existed. The surveyor, a quiet, methodical man named Frank Delgado, spent 2 days on my property with his equipment before he called me out to the back fence line, looking troubled. "Mr. Voss," he said, "I need you to see this." He walked me along the boundary, showing me where his instruments placed the true property line according to the original county deed, not the boundary the HOA's landscaping crew had been trimming to for years, and not even the line on the HOA's own subdivision plat. The real line, the one recorded in the county's original survey from back when this was still farmland, ran a full 11 feet past where everyone assumed it was. 11 feet past my fence. 11 feet into what the HOA called common area. And that 11 feet didn't just include grass and a walking path. It included a corner of the clubhouse. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the building, the tan stucco clubhouse with its cheerful blue awning, the place where the neighborhood hosted potlucks and holiday parties, the building at the literal center of Maple Hollow's community life, and Frank told me, in his careful, unemotional way, that according to the original deed, a portion of its southeast corner and a chunk of the attached parking lot sat on land that belonged to me. Not the HOA. Me. How is that possible? I asked. Frank explained it as best he could. Sometime in the transition from farmland to subdivision, back when the developer was platting out lots and common areas, someone had made an error transcribing the original deed language onto the new subdivision map. It happens more often than people think, he said. A typo in a bearing, a swap number in a distance measurement, and suddenly a boundary that should run one way runs another. Normally these errors get caught during construction. This one hadn't. It had sat there, quietly wrong, for almost 20 years, surviving every inspection, every permit, every closing, because nobody had ever gone back to the original county deed to check. My property, according to that original deed, the deed that legally still governed the land, mistake or no mistake, extended into the footprint of the Maple Hollow clubhouse. I didn't say anything to the HOA. Not yet. I want to be honest about why. Part of it was caution. I wanted to understand exactly what I was looking at before I said a word to anyone. Part of it was something else, something less noble, if I'm being truthful. I was still smarting from that first letter, from being treated like a rule breaker over a fence that had stood on that land longer than the entire subdivision. And some quiet, competitive part of me wanted to know the whole truth before I let the HOA know I had it. So I hired a real estate attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priya Anand, and asked her to review everything Frank had found. It took her 3 weeks. When she called me back, she confirmed what Frank had suspected. The original deed, filed with the county before the subdivision was ever built, was the controlling legal document. The HOA's plat map might be the one everyone had been using for 2 decades, but if it conflicted with the original recorded deed, the original deed won. Legally, functionally, undeniably, I owned 11 feet of land that the HOA had built on without ever realizing it wasn't theirs. You have options, Priya told me. You could file a quiet title action to formally establish the boundary. You could negotiate directly with the HOA for an easement or a sale. Or, she paused, you could just sit on this information and let them keep trespassing, technically, until you're ready to use it. I asked her what she'd do. I'd get proof of everything first, she said. Then decide. That's when the fence became more than a fence. It became my evidence. Here's the thing about HOAs. They love consistency, and they love precedent. If I rebuilt the fence exactly where it always stood, on the actual property line, and the HOA kept tearing it down or citing me for it, I'd have a clean paper trail showing they were repeatedly interfering with my legal property, unaware that they were doing so on land that belonged to me the whole time. So instead of moving the fence to appease them, I quietly restored it to the true property line, 11 feet further back than anyone realized, using Frank's survey stakes as my guide. I did this at night. Partly for practical reasons. I worked long hours, and evenings were when I had time. But partly, I'll admit, because I didn't want an audience. I didn't want Renee from the HOA office, or the landscaping crew, or my neighbor Gary who liked to walk his dog past the clubhouse every evening and comment on things, to see me methodically extending my fence 11 feet closer to their pool deck before I was ready to explain why. So for the better part of 2 months, I became a nighttime fence builder. I'd come home from work, eat dinner, wait until the sun went down, and then head out back with a headlamp, a post hole digger, and a truck bed full of cedar posts. I set each post exactly on Frank's stakes, checked and rechecked the measurements, and built a clean, sturdy line of fencing that crept, foot by foot, week by week, toward the edge of the clubhouse parking lot. Every few days, someone from the HOA landscaping crew would show up, confused, and rip out a section, assuming it was some kind of code violation or an overzealous homeowner ignoring a previous notice. I'd get another letter. I'd wait a few nights, then rebuild it. Not out of spite, out of documentation. Priya had told me to keep a paper trail, and every torn-out post, every citation, every dated photograph I took of the fence being removed became part of a file that grew thicker every week. It became something of a ritual. I'd get home, change into old work clothes, and wait for the porch lights across the neighborhood to click on one by one, a sign that most people had settled in for the evening. Then I'd carry my tools out back, set my headlamp to its lowest, least conspicuous setting, and get to work. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a subdivision at 10 at night. Sprinklers ticking off in the distance, the hum of someone's air conditioner, the occasional bark of a dog 2 streets over, and I came to genuinely enjoy it. Digging a post hole by hand, tamping gravel into place, checking a level by headlamp, gave me something to focus on besides the frustration of the daytime letters. My neighbors started to notice the fence kept reappearing after being taken down, and a rumor spread that I was just a stubborn guy having a slow-motion feud with the association over property lines. A few people thought it was funny. My neighbor Gary told me one evening, chuckling, that I was the guy who won't quit on that fence, and I let him believe that was the whole story, because in a way, it was. I just hadn't told him which fence, or how far it was eventually going to go. One night in late April, Gary caught me out there with a post hole digger a little past 10 o'clock, his dog straining at the leash toward the clubhouse lawn. He stood at a distance for a minute, watching me work by headlamp, then called out, half joking, that I must be planning to annex the pool while I was at it. I laughed and told him I was just stubborn about property lines. He shook his head, said something about hoping I knew what I was doing, and kept walking. I remember standing there afterward, tamping down the last of the gravel around a post, thinking that he had no idea how close his joke had landed to the truth. Not every encounter was that friendly. A member of the landscaping crew, a young guy named Tyler who mowed the common areas twice a week, eventually started timing his visits earlier in the morning specifically to catch whatever section of fence had gone up overnight. We had a few tense but polite conversations at the property line, him explaining he was just following his supervisor's instructions, me explaining I understood completely and had no issue with him personally. I made sure never to let my frustration land on the people doing the actual labor. They weren't the ones who'd drawn the map wrong 20 years earlier, and they weren't the ones threatening a lien on my house. I saved that frustration for the folder growing thicker on my kitchen table. The HOA board president, a retired dentist named Marcus Whitfield, eventually took a personal interest. He'd run the association for almost a decade and treated the neighborhood's bylaws the way some men treat scripture. At a community meeting that spring, he stood up during the open floor session and, without naming me directly, made a pointed comment about certain residents who thought association rules didn't apply to them, and reminded everyone that continued violations could result in escalating fines and, eventually, a lien on the property. I sat in the back of that meeting, in a folding chair, and said nothing. I just took notes. By early summer, I had what I needed. Frank's full survey report, cross-referenced against the county's original recorded deed. Priya's legal memo confirming the boundary discrepancy and its implications. A file of every HOA letter, notice, and fine I'd received over the fence, all dated, all referencing the same disputed strip of land. Time-stamped photographs of the fence being torn down by HOA crews, on land that legally belonged to me. And finally, a formal boundary survey filed with the county, making the true property line a matter of public record. The last piece fell into place at the end of June, when I received a letter, not the usual HOA violation notice, but something heavier. The association was formally proposing a lien against my property for what they called persistent violation of the community fencing guidelines, with an amount that would have made a serious dent in my savings if I let it stand. That was the moment I stopped playing defense. I requested time on the agenda for the next HOA board meeting. Renee, sounding a little surprised, asked what it was regarding. I told her it was regarding the fence dispute, and that I had documentation I wanted the board to review. She penciled me in for the second Tuesday in July. The meeting was held in the Clubhouse, the same building whose southeast corner sat, unknowingly, on my land. There's a kind of irony in that I still think about dozens of neighbors sitting in folding chairs under a roof that, according to a deed filed decades earlier, didn't fully belong to the organization that ran the meeting. Marcus opened the floor session the way he always did, reading through routine business, pool maintenance schedules, an upcoming landscaping contract, a reminder about noise ordinances during the 4th of July weekend. Then he got to new business and called my name. I stood up, walked to the small podium they kept near the coffee station, and set down a folder thick enough that a few people in the front row visibly straightened in their seats. I want to talk about the fence, I said, and about the letter proposing a lien on my house. Marcus, to his credit, tried to keep things procedural. Mr. Voss, we've been over the fencing guidelines. Association maintained common areas. That's the thing, I said. It isn't common area. Not all of it. I walked the room through it as plainly as I could. I explained that when I repaired my fence after the storm, the HOA had cited me for encroaching on common land. I explained that I'd hired a licensed surveyor to settle the question, expecting to be told I needed to move the fence a few feet. I explained what Frank had actually found, that the subdivision's plat map didn't match the original deed recorded with the county, and that the true property line, the legally controlling one, put a section of the clubhouse and its parking lot on land that was, and had always been, part of my property. The room went very quiet. Someone near the front, a man I recognized as one of the pool committee volunteers, let out a low, disbelieving laugh, the kind that comes out when a person doesn't know what else to do with a piece of information that big. A woman 2 rows behind him whispered something to her husband and pointed at the folder still sitting on the podium, as if she could read the deed from across the room just by staring hard enough. I passed around copies of Frank's survey and the relevant page from the original county deed, along with Priya's legal summary. I explained, as calmly as I could manage, that I hadn't gone public with any of this until I had it fully verified, because I didn't want to make an accusation I couldn't back up. I explained that I'd continued rebuilding my fence on the true property line, not to provoke anyone, but because it was, simply, my property, and I had every right to enclose it. Marcus read through the documents with an expression that shifted, slowly, from irritation to something closer to alarm. Renee, sitting beside him, went pale as she flipped to the deed page and compared the legal description against the numbers she clearly recognized from the HOA's own maintenance records. "This can't be right," Marcus said, though his voice had lost its earlier certainty. "It's been recorded with the county," I said. "You're welcome to have your own attorney review it." "I'd expect you to. But I wanted the board and the community to hear this from me directly before anyone assumed I was some rule-breaking neighbor who wouldn't listen to a simple fencing notice. I want to be clear about something, because this is the part where a story like this could easily turn into something ugly, and I didn't want that. I wasn't there to humiliate anyone, and I wasn't there to threaten a lawsuit that would tear the clubhouse down. I said as much, right there at the podium. "I'm not interested in kicking anyone out of their own clubhouse," I told the room. "I like this community. I like that pool. What I'm not willing to do is get fined and threatened with a lien over a fence I built on my own land, while nobody bothered to check whether the map they were using was even correct." I proposed, instead of a legal fight, a straightforward resolution. The association could formally purchase the strip of encroached land from me at fair market value, correcting the deed going forward so the clubhouse sat entirely on association property, the way everyone had always assumed it did. Or, if they preferred, we could establish a long-term easement agreement, at a fair and modest rate, so the building could remain exactly as it was without a costly reconstruction. Either way, I told them, I wanted the fencing fines and the proposed lien dropped, given that they'd been issued for activity on my own legally documented property. There was a long silence, and then an unexpected voice broke it, an older woman near the back, a long-time resident named Carol Simmons, who'd lived in the original farmhouse this whole subdivision had been built around before selling most of the land decades earlier. She said, quietly but clearly, that she remembered her father talking about a surveying dispute back when the developer first bought the farm, and that he'd always suspected the maps were drawn up in a hurry. That one comment did more to settle the room than anything in my folder. It turned an abstract legal argument into something that felt like a genuine, decades-old mistake finally coming to light, rather than a scheme. The board didn't make a decision that night. Marcus, looking considerably more subdued than when the meeting started, said they'd need to consult the association's own attorney and review everything I'd submitted. I told them that was completely reasonable, and I sat back down. Over the following weeks, the tone of every interaction with the HOA changed entirely. The letters stopped. The landscaping crew stopped touching my fence. Renee called me, this time not to issue a notice, but to ask, almost sheepishly, whether I'd be willing to meet with the association's attorney to discuss terms. We met 3 times over the course of a month. In the end, the association agreed to purchase the disputed strip of land from me at an appraised fair market value, formally correcting the deed so the clubhouse and parking lot sat entirely within association property, exactly as everyone had always believed. In exchange, every fine, notice, and the proposed lien against my house were permanently withdrawn, in writing. It wasn't a windfall that changed my life, but it was fair, and it was mine, earned through 11 months of quiet, careful persistence rather than a single dramatic confrontation. Marcus resigned from the board not long after, not in disgrace exactly, but with the quiet acknowledgement that a decade of enforcing rules with absolute certainty had been built, in this one case, on a map that was wrong from the start. Renee stayed on, and to her credit, she was the one who pushed hardest to make sure the whole community understood it wasn't my fault, or hers, but a 2-decade-old paperwork error nobody had ever thought to double-check. These days, my fence sits exactly where the original deed always said it should, at the true edge of my property, no longer at the edge of a dispute. The HOA's clubhouse sits, fully and legally, on land the association now actually owns, thanks to that sale. Gary still walks his dog past it every evening, and he still likes to joke that I'm the guy who wouldn't quit on that fence, except now the story he tells has a very different ending than the one he thought he knew. I think about my grandfather sometimes, out at that fence line, remembering how he used to tell me that the quietest fights are often the ones worth winning the most, because you don't waste your energy proving a point to people who aren't ready to hear it. You just keep showing up, post after post, night after night, until the truth is standing right there in the ground, impossible to argue with. Carol Simmons and I ended up becoming friends, of all things. She invited me over for coffee not long after that meeting, and she showed me old photographs of the farmhouse that used to stand roughly where the clubhouse pool now sits, along with a faded snapshot of the original property line, marked by a much older wooden fence her father had built by hand, the very same fence line, as it turned out, that I'd spent 2 months quietly restoring. She told me her father would have gotten a real kick out of the whole story, a stubborn homeowner outlasting a homeowners association using nothing but patience and an old survey. I think about that conversation more than almost any other part of this whole affair. The association, to their credit, handled the correction publicly and honestly once the paperwork was settled. They sent out a community newsletter explaining, in plain terms, that a decades-old surveying discrepancy had been identified and resolved, that the clubhouse boundary had been formally corrected, and that the homeowner involved, me, had worked cooperatively with the board to reach a fair resolution. It wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't an apology exactly, but it was honest, and it put an end to whatever rumors might have kept circulating if the whole thing had just quietly disappeared. These days, my fence sits exactly where the original deed always said it should, at the true edge of my property, no longer at the edge of a dispute. The HOA's clubhouse sits, fully and legally, on land the association now actually owns, thanks to that sale. Gary still walks his dog past it every evening, and he still likes to joke that I'm the guy who wouldn't quit on that fence, except now the story he tells has a very different ending than the one he thought he knew. I think about my grandfather sometimes, out at that fence line, remembering how he used to tell me that the quietest fights are often the ones worth winning the most, because you don't waste your energy proving a point to people who aren't ready to hear it. You just keep showing up, post after post, night after night, until the truth is standing right there in the ground, impossible to argue with. I didn't rebuild that fence to make a scene. I rebuilt it because it was mine to build, on land that was mine to claim, and because some truths only reveal themselves to people patient enough to keep digging, one post hole at a time, until the whole picture finally comes into the light.